Our next panel is a panel on movement of food and ag products. Gary Seifrith is going to be moderating. He's the Vice President of U.S. Grains Council, and joining him is Gary Martin and Lowell Randell. Gary's the CEO of North American Export Grain Associations and CEO of International Grain Trade Coalition, and Lowell, I think, will be virtual with us, and he is the Senior Vice President, Government and Legal Affairs for the Global Cold Chain Alliance. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Gary. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and thank the pleasure for being here and moderating the panel today. And it was said, we have Gary Martin, the CEO of the North American Grain Export Association, and I think Gary will also talk about his leadership involvement within the International Grain Trade Coalition, and covering the issues on movement of bulk grain and oil seeds, and then we'll also talk on the cold chain infrastructure with Lowell Randell from the Global Cold Chain Alliance. But just to get started, we've talked about trade and the importance of that in the U.S.-China relationship. But once we've agreed there's a need and a want to trade, the logistics and the supply chain becomes a very, very important part of that. The origination, the loading, the ocean transport, the unloading, the distribution on the other end, and it goes both ways. We get products leaving China coming to the U.S. and products from U.S. going to China, and the issues around that become very, very important, and the efficiencies of those logistics become very, very important for us to be able to have trade at economically available prices to the end consumer. So to get started, both our panelists are going to give some opening remarks, I think, and they have some slides, and just to kind of benefit our order of slides, we're going to have Lowell Randell start. So go ahead, Lowell.
Great, thank you. And first, let me apologize for not being able to be there in person. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay. Unfortunately, I have other travel this week that was scheduled before I knew about this event. So, but happy to join you through the use of technology. And as we think about coming out of the pandemic, I think one of the things that we've all learned is that no matter where we are in the world, as long as we have a decent Wi-Fi signal, we can do most everything that needs to be done, although it's hard to replace being in the same room with folks and having that interpersonal connection. So hopefully next time I'll be able to see you all in person. But as was mentioned, my name is Lowell Randell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Government and Legal Affairs for the Global Cold Chain Alliance. I've been with GCCA a little over 14 years now, and the GCCA is what I like to call a family of trade associations in the temperature-controlled logistics industry. And thanks for advancing that slide. We'll give you a little bit of an overview of who we are. And really, the history and the first big piece of our alliance deals with warehousing and logistics. And so these are our third-party cold storage facilities across the globe that really handle every kind of temperature-controlled food product that you can think of, whether that's refrigerated product to frozen product, and maintaining the safety, the quality, and the integrity of that product, and then help our members help their customers with the distribution of that product. And a lot of that is through international trade to and from China in many cases, but really across the globe. And I'll talk about our global footprint in a moment. But we also have a transportation arm, and that, again, touches every mode of transportation. So that could be over-the-road trucks, rail, and marine. There's been a lot of focus on marine transportation in the cold storage, and really across the board when you think about food and agricultural trade over the last few years. through the pandemic and some of the challenges that we've all experienced. Thankfully, things seem to be going a little bit more smoothly this year than the last couple. We also have a construction arm. And so through our Controlled Environment Building Association, or CEBA, that's design build firms that construct really any kind of facility that needs a specialized environment. And primarily that's going to be temperature control, but these are not only cold storage facilities, but food processing, manufacturing, and again, really anything that needs that type of specialized environment to handle the products. And then we do have a foundation as well, where we conduct global development projects. We've actually had a long history in exchange between the Global Cold Chain Alliance and China and other parts of Asia. We do global cold chain development projects working with government and foundation donors to do things like needs assessments and do multiple trainings and capacity building, technical assistance to ensure that the cold chain is strong globally. We believe that's critical for trade. It's also critical to reduce food loss and waste and improve the sustainability of the food supply chain. As I mentioned, we do have a very global footprint. We take the G&GCCA very seriously. So we've got over 1,500 member companies across the globe, and that spans 92 individual countries. Certainly China and the United States are prominent. About 50% of our members are inside North America, so that's US and Canada. And then the other 49% are really across the globe. We do have some international offices in South Africa, Brazil, Europe, and Latin America. Just a little bit about the scope of our industry. 99% of U.S. households have frozen foods. So that is a little different. That number is a little different as you look at different countries, but certainly in North America, frozen foods is a critically important segment. We've got 1,200 plus facilities representing over 6.3 billion cubic feet of storage. And when you look at what that translates into billions of pounds, and this is just a US number, 213 billion pounds of product that move through our member networks every year. So that is a critical component to any of the perishable commodities that need to move around the globe. Next slide, please. So some other things that we do, we are a body that believes in industry best practices. So one example of that comes in the area of the sanitary transportation of food. And when you think about some of the regulatory schemes in the United States, like the Food Safety Modernization Act, and then other countries, certainly China and others, have food safety standards, we want to provide industry with best practices. So we have a set of best practices and, in addition, a certification program called Certified Cold Carrier that is an important mechanism for assisting the industry in maintaining the safety and quality of food across the globe. Next slide. And then also we do industry recognition programs, and certainly the sustainability of the food supply chain and the food and ag industry is increasingly important. We take that seriously, so we've created an energy excellence recognition program trying to help our members improve their energy efficiency across the globe, and we believe that's a critical component to greening the supply chain. So those are just a couple of examples of some of the things that we're doing to address some of the trends, such as food safety, trade, and sustainability. We'll go to I think that may be my last slide.
All right.
So happy to be with you, and I look forward to participating in the panel.
All right. Thank you, Lowell. Before I move on to Gary here, probably take a minute or two even. kind of skipped over an introduction of myself. I'm the Vice President of the U.S. Grain Council. I've been with U.S. Grain Council over 29 years now. Yes. And Ryan LeGrand, our CEO, who isn't able to be here today, but had a nice video. So I won't get too in depth of what we do and our programming and relationship with our good customers in China. But as he mentioned, and even Jim Sutter mentioned, 2022 we celebrated our 40th anniversary, so over 40 years of investment. And as Jim said, the corn and sorghum and barley farmers, same with the soybean farmers, 40 years ago decided that was a good use of investing long before, 10, 15 years before we saw large amounts of trade. We thought there was a need to invest and have offices there, and actually I think they pretty much were open simultaneously, and we've had a wonderful relationship and kind of co-located offices with our U.S. Soybean Export Council friends. So, and with that, Gary has been around in the grain industry for many years, and Gary and I have known each other and worked with each other for probably decades even, but I'll let Gary introduce himself, and he has a few slides to talk about what the North American Export Grain Association does.
Thanks, Kerry, and I want to thank everyone who's been up here preceding me, but also all of you, first and foremost, because a lot of knowledge has been transferred today. And I'm not a very knowledgeable person, but so it's been great for me, quite a learning experience. But in the sort of, to paraphrase Albert Einstein, I hope we all know who Albert Einstein is. He said that knowledge has little value in practical application without experience. And it's that experience that I can bring to the table, particularly in the area of bulk grain movement, both globally and here in the United States. I'm entering my 6th decade in that involvement, more than 50 years. There's only one person in the audience, and I think she left because she's on the next panel, that I think carries that kind of experience that I have. Rebecca Doyle and I went to the University of Illinois together. And that was a long time ago. But I do, as I introduce, and I think we've got one of my slides up, and I'll use the first 3 only, just to cue things up a bit. The imagery there is about the industry that I'm quite involved in today at both the International Grain Trade Coalition, a Swiss-based NGO, and the North American Export Grain Association, really working at the core, really the trade practitioner area. If anything that I bring experience to the table in, it's in logistics, as Kerry suggested, contract execution, dispute resolution, addressing governments around the world about best official practices as well as best commercial practices. So when I got the offer from 2 of your sponsors to come out here today, I live near Washington, D.C., to come out here today during what is, for me, Holy Week. My family is gathered in Northern Virginia, so I'm eager to get back. I'll be leaving here soon and enjoy a bit of a celebration. I thought, well, I better look at what I can learn about this Heartland China Association, U.S. Heartland China Association. And I was quite impressed. First page on your website hasn't been mentioned today, but I'm going to read it because I'm a believer in what you're doing. Not all bridges are built of concrete and steel. Equally important, bridges are built on friendship, cultural communication, and commercial cooperation. Where these bridges exist, communities flourish. Thank you to the Heartland Association. Thank you to Bunge and U.S. Grains Council, who provided me with this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what I've learned from a few conversations I had, nobody knew the organizations I work with even existed. I can assure you that that's not the case in certain circles, but it is the case here today. So it's just great to be with you and talk a little bit about experience. What I want to end up doing is conveying a few thoughts, and I guess we've got the second slide up there already. Thanks for putting that up, and the third one will be up in just a minute. This is a look at the North American Export Grain Association. Many of those companies have been mentioned today, all the way, I think Benson Quinn was first mentioned earlier, all the way through Bunge, of course. They're the people, the investors in food systems around the world that have a primary base here in North America. Certainly includes Chinese-based companies as well as Japanese-based companies, even European-based companies. Again, to that point of logistics. And the lesson we've learned at the North American Export Grain Association in what is now 112 years of existence in contract, commercial relationship, execution areas is that the world is not flat. Logistics matter. And in particular, what I've taken from the conversations with all of you today, the knowledge you've imparted, is, I think, a couple of very important messages. Global food security, and I would note that food security, by most definitions, includes a concept of providing for adequate choice, as well as nutrition and affordability. I haven't heard the word choice yet today in reference to food security, but providing for adequate food security means choice as well as affordability, and of course, predominantly safety. It is really dependent upon a global sourcing capacity, and that global sourcing capacity is best positioned in a competitive, well-informed marketplace. So that's kind of lesson one I've drawn from our conversation today. Second is the second topic of sustainability, and the sustainability journey we're all on, likewise, is best supported, and in particular to make progress along the sustainability journey via a global view. Those two strong interests in global food security and sustainability measures across the board, including agriculture and specific, have also given me the conclusion today that the tie that binds the U.S. and China is logically more than agricultural productivity, but certainly includes this key topic of agricultural productivity that you're all addressing. But that tie that binds us together is the ability to move forward along both lines and provide for a global marketplace and a well-informed global marketplace to achieve those goals, whether they be individual enterprise goals or goals of individual governments that we're all dealing with. These two countries in particular are in great position to move forward, embracing global food security and embracing a global marketplace. This is the second organization I work with, and I want to point out a couple of organizations that are involved there. In addition to all of those U.S. entities on what I guess is your left-hand side listed there, the Chinese National Association of Grain Sectors is there, and of course the chairman of COFCO is also the chairman of the Chinese National Association of Grain Sectors. They're our partners in this global enterprise based in Geneva, Switzerland, along with U.S. Soybean Export Council and U.S. Grains Council, who are also very prominent here today. and many, many companies like Kafko and Bunge. Very informative in our pursuit of facilitating trade and making trade work and doing that together, which is what we do as a federation and a global federation. So the world's not flat. We can't do this without a global view, but we can do this together, the US and China in particular, but we've got to have partners across the board. I was also taken by some of the references to what I would say from a global food security and sustainability perspective is a logical division of concepts and business concepts moving forward. One is short term. There is an acute, critical need to reverse the tide in the short term with respect to global food security. There's also short-term interest to begin to get down that sustainability journey and get down that sustainability journey more aggressively. The 600 million metric tons of bulk grain products that are currently moving into the marketplace, it'll be 1 billion metric tons, not in my lifetime, but in the next 30 or 40 years. That is the critical balance for food security and a significant contributor to the sustainability journey itself. So that observation alone, based again from the knowledge you've all imparted today, is one that I hope you have the opportunity to take away. I'm here to learn. I think that the information that I've received will help in developing our policies as we work together to make trade work and facilitate investment. I've got several other slides. I think I'll stop here because I think you need time to ask questions. But Carrie, you know me, Carrie. Jim knows me too. Very seldom does anyone even get on a conference call with me that I don't say that I can probably hold my comments to 90 minutes. But it would be difficult. So I'm going to try to restrict myself, particularly because I have to get home to see my 1.5-year-old granddaughter who just showed up today in Virginia. So, Carrie, I'll turn it back to you. If you want me to show some more slides, I'll do that. So, thank you.
If we have time, we'll get to them. But appreciate that, Gary. And it's actually great to be on the panel with you. Normally, if you and I are in a Zoom meeting or an actual conference room, we're discussing some kind of issue or problem with movement of grain and oilseeds around the world. So it's great to actually be here talking about the positivity of movement and trade between U.S. and China. But so I have a few questions for both of you, but I'll start with Lowell. Obviously, the height of the COVID pandemic, and we'll say the height lasted at least 2 years, if not longer. Global supply chains, especially cold chain movement of food and agricultural products, probably much more than the bulk grains and oilseeds, was drastically affected. Where are we at today with what's going on the global movement of cold chain egg products as we're starting to come out of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I probably don't need to go into too much detail about the challenges that we all lived through over the last couple of years, but they were very real and numerous. Happy to say that as I talk with our members who are trading, across the Pacific in between China and the United States, or across the Atlantic as well, that the situation is much improved. Are there still some bottlenecks? Yes, but that's to be expected. I think we've recalibrated some of the challenges regarding container availability, container cost, have mitigated. And so I don't know if I want to say we are normalized again, but I think the situation is much more manageable, and that we're seeing a more predictable flow of containers and by extension product back and forth than certainly we were a couple of years ago. I think you've seen ports, certainly here in the United States, take some specific steps to help make themselves more efficient and address some of these challenges, whether that's chassis pools. I know we worked closely with the Department of Agriculture on supporting a refrigerated chassis pool at the Port of Houston, which really helped increase the capacity for refrigerated and frozen cargo. A lot of that's going to go in and out of the port, some to China, some to other parts of the world, back and forth. But I think we saw ports take creative steps to address some of these challenges, and we saw similar things in the Port of Oakland, Port of Seattle, that I think were all very welcomed steps, and applaud government and private sector for coming together and being creative as we dealt with some of the acute problems. And now that we're in a more stable situation, I think we'll see the fruits of all of that labor.
All right, thank you, Lowell. And as I said, the COVID pandemic probably didn't have near as much of an issue on bulk grain and oilseed movement. But Gary, what needs to be in place today to provide for resilient and reliability in the movement of grains and oilseeds around the world?
Thanks, Kerry. Well, just reflecting back a little bit on the last 3 years, it did sharpen our focus on resiliency and reliability. And we know a couple of things, and I'm going to use some big words, at least big words from an undereducated boy from Illinois. But I talked about contingency planning. We're woefully short on that, particularly in the public sector. Public sector tends to be reactive and not well positioned from a contingency planning standpoint. All of our communication has that. We also learned that resiliency in the movement of these grain and oilseed supplies, these raw materials, for either direct human consumption or for further processing, whether it be for some energy use or food use, is very closely tied to the concept of adequate fungibility. Now, I know that's a tough word. I hope you take some time to think about it, but it's really substitutability. All due credit to what happened in the Black Sea post the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. All due credit to the World Food Programme's efforts and the efforts of the government of Turkey and other governments to become engaged in a corridor. The reason the wheat price broke, it's now half of where it peaked just a year ago. The initial reason was entirely tied to being able to source globally and having a fungibility and supply of the wheat product itself. Likewise for sunflower seeds, certainly there was backfilling effort by official bodies. I have to give all the credit in the world to David Beasley, who is retiring this week over at the World Food Program, and people like Amr Badawi, who also happens to be a NAGA arbitrator, long experience, who handles logistics, to even the International Maritime Organization for their planning and their work with governments to open up the corridor, and of course to the Europeans to opening up overland flows for Ukrainian goods. But the reason and the fundamental support for resiliency that resulted in success and continues to result in success, long-term and short-term, in providing for these basic products for food, feed, and processing, dry bulk, grains and oilseeds is fungibility. That's the key to the trade. And it reverberates across the industry. If you look at the contractual practices we deploy, it means that you have to have access to supplies. You also have to have access to information to label supplies. That means information about regulatory aspects that have been well covered with respect to crop biotechnology, somewhat covered with respect to crop protection chemicals, crop protection products. You have to have access to information to provide for that flow, to provide for the ability for, doggone it, India's got some wheat, and we can get it into Egypt. That was very short term, but it was a substitutable portion. I was with the Egyptian government when that happened because of my relationships, and it tells us a story that we need to think about here. How do we provide for marketability? So I'm going to make a point here to both U.S. producers and those of you who are involved in building productivity in the world, but most particularly a point to the Chinese province representatives. And it's going to be a get ready. It's going to be a contingency planning point. Those of you in those very capable provinces in China need to think about your export capacity and integrating yourselves into the global export markets, even for grains and oilseeds. I'm not saying China's going to become a net grain exporter, but the highest and best use of your product and the most sustainable use of your product may be in the export markets. Are you ready as you build productivity, as you deploy what you need to deploy? That's what we work with the Chinese National Association of Grain Sectors on, is providing for access to Chinese grain around the world. That's a reality. For those of us here in the United States, trade's a two-way street. Likewise, highest and best use. I mean, one of the speakers earlier today alluded to the concept of economic efficiency and how it makes it, why it justifies an attitude not to self-sufficiency. There's lots of concepts there, there's lots of theories there, but again, experience says trade's a two-way street. Investment must be supported, investment must be protected to provide for a trade going both ways. We're using a lot of grain and oilseeds in the United States for energy production, more and more every day. Be ready for imports in the United States and embrace them. The only way we optimize against these two challenges of sustainability and food security is to provide for global trade and investment flows, and that's a two-way street. So as we move forward, that tie that binds that I mentioned earlier is moving forward with that understanding. The knot will be produced from one end of the rope, import, the other end of the rope, export, for both countries. Lots of other things come to mind, Kerry, but I wanted to make that point.
All right. My next question for Lowell, and you talked about your energy efficiency certification program, but along the line, of greening and sustainability trends, where do you see those going in the cold supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, this is something that we as an association have been thinking about quite a bit over the last few years, and we see ESG sustainability as a trend that is just going to accelerate. And so we need to find ways to ensure that that our industry is working with its supply chain partners to achieve those goals. We feel like energy efficiency is one of the one of the big pieces of the puzzle for our industry, because energy, we're huge energy consumers. When you think about a big cold storage warehouse, you've got two main costs: labor and energy. And so if you can make strides in decreasing the amount of energy that's used and increase the efficiency, you are going to decrease that carbon footprint significantly. I would also say there's another piece to this when you look at food loss and food waste. And that's a big priority for us. We've got partnerships with the Global Food Banking Network, Feeding America, and other entities that are working to ensure that food is not lost or wasted. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity, because every time a piece of food is put into a landfill or lost, thrown away, you think about the environmental impact, all of the inputs to that agricultural commodity, the fuel used to transport it, processing, manufacturing, storage, et cetera, all of that is going to loss. So we know there are hungry people across the globe, and we need to break down barriers to food donation. We recently passed the Food Donation Improvement Act here in the United States. I think that was a good step towards improving the environment for making more food donations so we lose and waste less. I would encourage China to look at ways to incentivizing food donations for safe and still quality products so that it doesn't get lost. But there's also cold chain capacity development, particularly in the developing parts of the world, where you can reduce loss and waste. And if you do that efficiently and use your energy efficiently, you're going to be more sustainable and greener. One last point on sustainability, that's particular to the cold chain environment, is HFCs. So you may be familiar or have heard of the Kigali Amendment and the use of HFCs as synthetic refrigerants that have global warming potential. That's another area where I think you're going to see continued movement in greening the global food supply chain, is moving away from high global warming potential refrigerants to more natural refrigerants such as ammonia, CO2, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, to green the supply chain. And those are three or four of the ways that we're trying to prioritize and focus in for our industry.
All right. Gary, what do you see on the bulk grain side of things?
Thanks so much, Lowell, because you brought up a topic that I think maybe we underemphasized today, and that is the waste side of the equation. Of course, with the cold chain, it's all about that direct impact on waste. But there's a waste concern that can be addressed with efficiency in the global movement of these dry bulk raw materials. They're still perishable, just not as perishable as that frozen cut that Lowell works with. And the gains, and we've got some great information coming out of some of our member companies. I think someone suggested earlier that we need a 35% increase in supply. I'll take that estimate as accurate. Again, I learned about that from somebody today. We think in the bulk grain and oilseed supply chain that we can improve about 15% if we can reduce waste. And that's all about, in our case, two things: reducing trade barriers. Time is money, but time is also grain respirating in the hold And when you got 60,000 tons in hundreds of vessels moving around the world each day, that's waste. Time is food. Time is energy from grain. So if you can reduce time, you do that with reduced regulatory barriers, improved information flow, and here's most important, and where we're really got a strong initiative going, and I have to ask Shauna N. Cross from Bunge to stand up. She just showed up. She's one of the people from our industry leading our digitalization initiative. As we embrace the digitalization ecosystem, we're greatly reducing time. It's also a cost efficiency measure as well. But if you look at things like the International Plant Protection Convention's ePhyto solution and other digital ecosystem initiatives, it's not just about less paper and paperless trade. It's about time. Time is money. Time is real in our business, just as it is in the cold chain, and the gains from a digital environment just to exchange data are enormous. It takes a global response to make it effective because we're still in a global sourcing as well as global consumption world.
All right.
Gary,
Go ahead, Lowell.
could I just jump in and follow up? 100% agree with everything that was just said. And just to put a finer point on the perishables side of things, the timing is so critical. And so when you've got product that's on the water and it arrives in an overseas destination and there's maybe a typo on a on an export certificate or bill of lading and there's delays, well, those delays deteriorate potentially the quality and safety of the product over time, the value of the product over time. If you have to turn that around and ship it back to its point of origin, you're risking the loss of the product, but then you're also spending tremendous amounts of additional fuel and other resources that really are going to know. I've heard talk about the highest value use. That's not the highest value use of those resources when you've got some of these regulatory hurdles that or non-tariff trade barrier kind of hurdles that come up that are restricting the flow. So it's not just the trade numbers, but there's a whole lot of other impacts to those delays. So appreciate you bringing that up, Gary, and just wanted to share a little bit more on that point.
All right, thanks, Lo. We got only a couple more minutes, so I'm going to steal a question from the last panel to kind of end on a fun note here. And I spent a few years living in Beijing, running the U.S. Grain Council's China office. But let me ask Gary your most memorable experience of traveling to China.
Remember, I've got 6 decades involvement here, so I'm going to say, first part of those 6 decades, it was the opportunity to work with the World Bank and Chinese leadership in drafting the Urban China Plan. I hope all of you have. I know it's still out there if you want to read it and buy it from Amazon or Alibaba or whoever. It's still there. But that was so informative and so well thought out. Urban China, that's all you have to know. World Bank publication, very informative for today. Second, again, in China, when I was called in to discuss with Chinese decision and thought leaders liquidation of corn stocks. Talk about a way to avoid waste and identify stocks and how you do that. If you look at my career, I was the Commodity Credit Corporation officer responsible for liquidation of the U.S. corn stocks in the 90s. I signed all those PIC certificates for those of you farmers who may auto pen, and learned a lot of lessons from that, some questionable experiences. I've learned more from my failures than my successes. But And then the final opportunity again, well, just this past year was when the Chinese government authorities asked myself and representatives of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States to sit down over a Zoom call and talk about how to facilitate exports of Chinese grain. What needs to be in place now that China is innovating crop biotechnology? Fantastic opportunity to reflect on experience and learn from others.
All right. Lowell, do you have a quick, memorable experience of traveling to China?
Yeah, so I don't have near the long history of travel to and from China as my fellow panelists. I've been a couple of times, and once in a more official capacity when I was working for the Department of Agriculture, and looking at how to cooperate more in the food and ag space was tremendous to learn more about the rich history and culture of China. Got to visit the Great Wall and some other amazing things. But in my cold chain capacity, I had the opportunity. We were doing some trainings on cold chain capacity development, and I had an opportunity to visit the port of Dandong that was building out some cold storage capacity, and it was fascinating to see the development of that port as well. So not nearly the long history as Gary, but I do very much value the time I've been in China.
All right, thank you, Lowell. And again, really appreciate both Lowell and his expertise on the cold chain movement, and Gary and his expertise on bulk grain and oil seeds, and logistics and the importance of those for the ag and food product trade between our two countries. So with that, please give a big round of applause to our panel.